go live on the actual broadcast here in just a moment. And then I'll cut my audio, so you'll be on your own then. Here in just a moment.
Okay, perfect. I see it and my audio is off on Facebook. Great.
Okay.
Thanks. So just give me the hi sign.
Okay, I'm going live now, Naomi.
Okay. Hello and welcome to our new webcast series, VFX Pros Home Edition, delivering exclusive interviews and dynamic content amidst these unprecedented times. VFX Pros Home Edition is your new channel for VFX stories behind the scenes, live conversations about cutting-edge technologies and techniques, discussions around the VES 70 most influential visual effects films, and more. We're delighted that you're joining us for today's interactive discussion on HDR and Dolby Vision, led by senior pros at Dolby, Thomas Graham, A.B. Matthew, and Bill Villarreal. We will begin shortly. I'm Naomi Goldman, VES Communications Director. As your moderator, let me share just a few housekeeping details. The webcast will run about an hour. It's being recorded and will be available later on the VES websites and on our social media channels, and we'll post the details at the end of the session. If you're joining us on Zoom and would like to ask Thomas, A.B., or Bill a question, go to the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, click Q&A, and type in your question. If you're on Facebook Live, enter your question as a comment. We can't promise we'll get to all of them, but we'll do our best. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about our guests, and then we'll get started. Thomas Graham is head of Dolby Vision Content Enablement at Dolby Labs and is a veteran of the post-production industry who's worked for companies including DigiDesign, Avid, and Dolby. He was one of the first to use Pro Tools to record and edit the orchestra on Hollywood scoring stages on more than 40 feature films, including Collateral, Ice Age, Star Trek Nemesis, Solaris, and Serenity. A.B. Matthew is Senior Staff Content Engineer at Dolby Labs. After formal training as an engineer, he began his career in the content creation industry as a 3D animator and VFX artist using Alias Power Animator, Maya, Flame, and Inferno. He was previously at Autodesk as the Flame and Luster product specialist for the Asia Pacific region. And Bill Villarreal is a VES board member and longtime member of the VFX and animation community since the mid-80s. He is Senior Director of Content Research at Dolby Labs. He was part of the original development team of Dolby Vision and Dolby Cinema, and is currently working on Dolby Vision and Dolby Cinema next generation enhancements. Thank you, Thomas, A.B., and Bill for joining us. And I am going to kick it over to you to take us through your presentation, and we'll take questions along the way.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi. And thanks, Bill and A.B., for joining me here. Hopefully, you guys can see my screen now of my presentation. And A.B., say hello so we can see your video as well.
Hi. Can you hear me?
There you are. Yep.
All clear? All right.
Bill, say hello so we can see you.
Hi. Welcome, everybody.
Great.
Let me unmute my video.
There you go. Awesome. All right. So we're joining you. All three of us are here in Los Angeles, and it's a sunny day, so we're excited about that. And we're also excited to share with you this presentation, kind of an overview, as Naomi said, of HDR and Dolby Vision, and how the VFX community can work to prepare for this technology. And it's been exciting. It's an exciting time in television. There's so many shows. We'll also be discussing a bit about the cinema implications as well. So without further ado, we'll get going here, and we'll pause at various times for questions. So Dolby Laboratories, based in San Francisco, was founded by Ray Dolby in the middle 1960s. And Ray was an engineer inventor, and he started specifically focusing in on how he could improve sound recordings by reducing tape hiss. So he created Dolby noise reduction, and that made its way into film in the late 60s, early 70s. And then from there, he worked to expand Dolby sound in film, whether it was Dolby stereo in the middle 70s, all the way up to modern surround sound and now what's known as Dolby Atmos. So our company is based in San Francisco. Roughly a third of our employees are scientists and engineers that are really crafted in the mold of Ray Dolby and what Ray was about. And we focus in on really science and technology of improving and delivering the best possible experience to the consumer. And this is one of our research labs based in San Francisco. And Bill is part of the team that does a lot of the research. And in this case, they're studying brain waves of a person who's watching high dynamic range imaging and studying all sorts of ways in that improving imaging can make the experience so much more immersive for the consumer. So we started this journey about 15 years ago, and it started with looking at modern digital cinema cameras. And over time, they've steadily improved in quality and capability. Most people think of them in terms of pixel count. So we hear about 4K cameras, 6K cameras, 8K cameras. And in terms of production, pixel count is an extremely important thing to consider. If you look at a filmmaker like, say, David Fincher, whose very meticulous camera work is so lauded and applauded, I should say too, that he perhaps is shooting on a helicopter or drone that's chasing this truck across the bridge, and shooting in 8K or 6K allows him to then recenter the truck, making sure the truck stays in the center of the image and stabilize that image so that there's no motion judder or shaky cam. So pixel count, extremely important and growing leaps and bounds. But in terms of two lesser known facts about these cameras, they are now able to capture an incredible dynamic range. Some of the RED cameras now even say up to 17 stops of dynamic range that they're able to capture. But certainly most of them can capture up to 15 usable stops. And they also can capture a wide color gamut. And Dolby sort of looked at this and said, well, it's a shame that we aren't looking at that or seeing that, because our color grading and image creation standard is based on cathode ray tube televisions. So this is the term you'll hear me use quite a bit today. Standard dynamic range television is really a very old standard. It's been around for a long time. It's based on a limited brightness of 100 nits of peak brightness and a very narrow contrast range, and also a very limited color palette known as Rec 709. So those 15 stops of dynamic range essentially have to get squeezed down to about 6.5 usable stops of dynamic range. And colorists and content creators have gotten very good at this, and they use a lot of tricks of the trade, like power windows and keys and all sorts of things like that. But the truth of the matter is you can't actually buy one of these televisions anymore, right? Everybody's now able to buy these amazing 4K flat panel TVs, or they're able to watch amazing shows on their iPad or iPhone. And if you go to a website like ratings.com, you're able to see what do these televisions really do in standard dynamic range mode. So you can see just a couple statistics I pulled from this recent review in February, that several of these TVs take your 100 nit signal and they stretch it to real scene peak brightness of about 630 nits all the way up to almost 900 nits of peak brightness. So that is, not the ideal for a studio or a filmmaker to have their content stretched. You'll notice I also have on the right, some of these TVs have HDR peak brightness capabilities up to 1400 nits of peak brightness. And we'll define nits a little bit more in a minute here. But just to give you an example, Dolby said, well, what if we could harness the capability of these TVs for good and deliver the artistic intent of the content creator? So the other thing that's changed since, say, the early 90s or so is that people no longer are just watching film in the theater or cathode ray tube images at home. There's now so many different devices, and each of these devices have so much varying capability that, again, that presents an even bigger challenge for filmmakers. And so Dolby said, well, we have relationships with all these manufacturers. What if we could identify the capabilities of each device and create a system where the image was sent to the device along with metadata that could tell the image and tell the TV how to best map that image? And so really, that's the heart of Dolby Vision, is how to best deliver artistic intent created by the content creator to the consumer across a wide range of devices and deliver it truthfully and respectfully. And so we do that through metadata, and we'll be talking about some of that today. Meanwhile, the TV industry, consumer industry, was focused in on more pixels for the consumer. And there's sort of mixed reviews on delivering, say, more pixels to the consumer. Obviously, it's 4 times the data down the pipe. So even broadcast, it's a challenging situation where, say, DirecTV only has a few channels in 4K per se, or UHD. And many consumers don't sort of understand that you have to be a certain distance from the TV to get that benefit. And essentially on a 65-inch TV, you really need to sit about less than 5 feet with an average set of eyes to really be able to take advantage of those extra pixels. Some other filmmakers have sort of leaned on higher frame rate as another way to sort of improve the entertainment experience. And filmmakers like Ang Lee, creating a movie like Gemini Man in high frame rate, have had some pretty cool results. But again, sometimes mixed reviews. Consumers say, oh, maybe it looks too much like video, or too much like TV or a soap opera. So again, both of these, more pixels, faster pixels, are here, and filmmakers are using them. But ultimately, Dolby found through research that by creating more contrast, more dynamic range, both brighter and darker pixels, and more colorful pixels, taking advantage of a wider color gamut and the ability to have more saturation, provided a better experience at any resolution and any frame rate. So Dolby Vision can work on HD resolution. It doesn't have to be UHD. And Dolby Vision can work at 24 frames or 60 frames per second. So how did we get there? Well, we looked at the capabilities of the human eye. And as we all know, when we go outside on a sunny day, your eye adapts and you're able to handle really bright lights. Like, for instance, here we went outside in the parking lot with a light meter, and you can see we measured the hood of the car there at about 6,000 nits of peak brightness. And we measured the sidewalk at about 10,000 nits. And yet your eye can still comfortably see in the shadows roughly 185 nits there, or 15 nits behind the tire. So you see that your eye is capable of handling so much more dynamic range than is in that 100 nit television signal. And so we created basically a research display, and this display had a backlight of a cinema projector, and the front light was an LCD screen, and together they could create amazingly bright images up to 20,000 nits of peak brightness and black levels down to 0.004 nits, so very, very dark, much beyond the 100 nit TV standard. And we showed a bunch of average test subjects the images and some images and said, here's some controls. You dial the highlights up where you think they should be, and you can adjust the black levels where you think they should sit. And when you look at the results of that research, basically from top to bottom is the number of people, the percentage of people who took the test. And then from left to right is black level all the way up to peak brightness. So you can see the projector, the display, research display was capable of 20,000 nits. And the research showed that 84% of the people dialed the highlights up to 10,000 nits of peak brightness and the black levels down to 0.01. And so Dolby felt that 84% was really a good chunk of change of people, and that led to Dolby proposing the standard for HDR television to be a 10,000 nit capable container. Now 10,000 nits certainly does sound crazy and very bright to watch a television, and seems like it's probably very far off in the distant future, but actually Sony showed a TV at CES 2 years ago that was a prototype TV capable of 10,000 nits. And there are several TVs currently on the market that are capable of around 1,500 to 2,000 nits. So the market is growing, and the consumer demand was sort of proven in this experiment. So Dolby said this 10,000 nit container, as I said, should be the representation for HDR television. And we created a new way to represent luminance called PQ, which we'll talk about here next.
Hey, Tom,
yeah.
can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
While you're rolling here, we have a question for you, which says, when showing HDR content on HDR 4K TV sets, what method do you recommend for calibrating the display in real-world consumer settings, like a client's lobby? And what's the HDR equivalent to the color bars and blue filter method?
Great questions. Part one of that question we'll be covering shortly. It's called CalMan software, and they make a relatively affordable package for the consumer that allows you to calibrate your TV in HDR and Dolby Vision specifically. And part two, in terms of bars and color, Bill, would you want to take that one?
Yeah. So we're currently working on that. This is really a something that needs, ideally will come out of SMPTE in a standardized form of color bars. We have developed an internal test pattern that we've been using internally. Ultimately, that will have to get proposed through the SMPTE, basically framework for standards approval. But there isn't really anything standard out there right now. We've been sharing this test frame that we have with various partners, business partners, and they've been using that. So hopefully within the next not too distant future, SMPTE will come out with something that's more standardized for people to use.
Great. Thank you so much. Why don't you guys keep on going?
You got it. So I skipped ahead there, sorry. There we go. All right. So in terms of this chart, again, from left to right, you're seeing black level to 10,000 nits of peak brightness. And then in terms of the bottom to top, you're seeing basically the contrast steps. And the dotted line in the middle basically shows the sensitivity of your eyes. So if we were to show you two patches of gray and raise the luminance on one of the patches of gray, until you noticed a difference in light change, that would essentially map out that curve you see there, the sensitivity of the eye. So gamma, 10-bit gamma is what you're used to looking at in standard dynamic range televisions. So you can see that it's a linear function and that your eye is actually a logarithmic curve, that the curve there. And you'll notice that part of the gamma, 10-bit gamma curve is above the threshold that your eye can notice the differences, basically. So you've probably all seen in standard dynamic range television when there are banding lines or contouring lines in the shadows. And that's a result of the fact that your eye is able to work better than the linear 10-bit gamma function. So when Dolby looked at creating HDR, essentially we felt we should take advantage of what our eye can see and create a curve that works just like our eye, but also be below that threshold and not waste any bits. So if you were going to stay with gamma and you wanted to basically work in HDR, you probably would have to create like a 15-bit gamma signal to be below the threshold and maintain that detail. In terms of PQ, it's a luminance curve that's designed to represent luminance for HDR images up to 10,000 nits and be very efficient and basically work just like our eye does. So SMPTE adopted PQ, or perceptual quantization, as the standard for HDR10 and Dolby Vision. So currently in the US, anytime you're working in HDR, you're going to be creating and looking at PQ as a signal. So any questions about PQ? I'll pause there because I know that can be a mouthful.
Hi. Hey, Tom. Well, we have a question, kind of a two-part question, which is how much variation is there between people's vision for that type of curve? Is it minimal or negligible for most of our purposes, or is there enough variation that it is worth accounting for?
Bill, maybe you could take that because I'm not as familiar with how much variation there would be in the Barton ramp comparatively.
Yeah, I don't know either. Or there's some color scientists, Dolby color scientists that actually developed the PQ curve, and the Barton ramp obviously was developed by Barton, and that it is an average response curve. I don't know what the tolerance is over or what the range of variation is over average human beings, but it obviously is an average, and based on a study that Barton did some time ago. Sorry.
Sure. No worries. Good. Any other questions?
Give me 1 second. There's a question about how would we look at or convert to PQ on the monitor?
Great question. And I think we'll be covering that coming right up here. But essentially, you would want to look at your VFX and images that you're creating in PQ, and the monitors out there support PQ, professional monitors, semi-pro monitors, and consumer monitors, and you would convert that probably using a lookup table. But we should be covering that here shortly. And speaking of monitors, in terms of professional monitors, Dolby created a monitor called the Pulsar, which is capable of 4,000 nits. And we did it pretty much as a research display when we sort of invented PQ and wanted the industry to move towards HDR. And so there's about 15 or 16 of them out there in the real world. But more likely than not, you're going to find a monitor like the Sony BVM X300 or Sony BVM HX310, which are capable of 1,000 nits of peak brightness. So Canon, Flanders, Postium, ISO, and Sony all make professional 31-inch displays that are used in terms of color grading and content creation. Now, I put the 2018 model of the LG in my presentation here. A lot of a lot of post facilities will have these LG consumer monitors, these OLED monitors, and they're capable of around 600 to 700 nits when calibrated. Typically, they're not used for color grading, but they do have other uses that we'll be talking about and sharing with you. So we talked a little bit about luminance. Let's sort of transition to talk about color gamut. And you guys, I'm sure, have all seen the CIE chart that shows red, green, and blue colors and the way our eye perceives color. And then you've seen these different triangles that represent the color gamut. Standard dynamic range imagery and most imagery for VFX is typically in that small inner triangle called Rec. 709, which is also very close to sRGB. So for home television, the color gamut most used is Rec. 709. The next bigger triangle is called DCI P3, and it's based on the digital cinema initiative that happened in the early 2000s. It's a wider color gamut, so you can see that you're able to see more greens and reds. And the example I like to give is, let's say you're working on a movie like Rocky, and the boxing gloves are very red, and you're seeing those boxing gloves. The cinema version is a bit more red, vibrant red, and probably the true red you picked. And then when you do the home consumer SDR version, you have to shift that red inside the Rec. 709 triangle, and it becomes a bit more orangish. So when you see both side by side, you can really see the difference. But when you're watching the home version by itself, your brain kind of fills in the gap and says, oh yeah, that's a red boxing glove. The next biggest triangle, Rec. 2020, is a bit more of a theoretical standard. There are no displays that can reproduce 100% of the Rec. 2020 triangle that you see. Although most consumer displays are in Rec. 2020. So when you calibrate a monitor, typically on a professional monitor, you might get 85% of Rec. 2020. So that means it's not hitting all the primaries perfectly. It goes about 80% of the way to those primaries for red, green, and blue. Most Dolby Vision TVs, most Dolby Vision content created for the consumer in television is created to a P3 standard. So what does that mean? Essentially, compared to standard dynamic range, you're seeing more color, greens and reds, than you would typically see on a home image. In terms of cinema, Dolby Cinema, our laser projector does support primaries very close to Rec. 2020. So that means a filmmaker could essentially make a Dolby Cinema version that takes advantage of very wide red, green, and blue laser primaries. And we've seen that with several filmmakers, like the folks who did Lego Batman and the folks at Pixar, like in terms of shows like Inside Out. They're willing to create a Dolby Vision version that has these incredible wide color gamuts. So hopefully when we all get back in the cinema, you can go to a Dolby Cinema and see a great animated movie like that. Now, in terms of color volume, it's actually also a very interesting story. So if we take that CIE chart and we lay it flat, and then we add luminance as the Y component, as we raise the brightness of those colors, you'll see that the Rec. 709 SDR container is very small, only 100 nits of peak brightness, and it's not equal. The blue and the red and the green channels have different strengths that they can basically tolerate. So what that means is, as a colorist, you can't just keep jamming up the blue to make the blue more bright. You'll get to a point around 7 or 8 nits of pure blue, and it starts to desaturate and becomes gray or white. And so colorists have to spend time essentially adjusting the red and the green channel down if they want more blue to appear, and therefore the picture gets slightly darker. In terms of the BT2100, that's essentially looking at the HDR Rec 2020 container. And you'll see that at 10,000 nits, you can have much more vibrant, saturated, lifelike color. And so really that's what Dolby Vision, one of the huge benefits is, even if your colors are limited to that Rec 709 triangle, you can make them very vibrant and saturated. Where in SDR, you have that challenge. So we'll pause here if there's any questions about color gamut or color volume.
Let me toss one question to you. I'm finishing a movie. This is from someone who's the DP, and we're deciding if we do a P3 color grading and then 2 days of retouch for the HDR version, or if we do the HDR version and 2 days of retouch for the SDR version. Which do you recommend as the proper or best way to approach that?
Great question. And we will cover some of that. They are two separate deliverables. So much of the work can be utilized in terms of creating an image. Either one could be your starting point. And Bill, you can jump in on this. But essentially working in P3 as a sound color gamut to support for your cinema, and then go to create your home deliverable from that starting point. Bill, you want to comment?
Yeah, in terms of dynamic, yeah, and certainly that's true for color. And then in terms of dynamic range or peak luminance, you know, we feel that HDR first is effectively the way of the future. There are a lot of different decisions that need to be made around that, though, that are both creative and business. When you do the HDR version, you tend to see more, obviously, based on the stuff that Tom's been showing you, you see more of the image, and so you can make these creative decisions about the entire captured range of the film or you know, or TV episode that you've been working on. So you can make those decisions around all of that high dynamic range input data that you have from the cameras, and then derive the SDR versions, you know, more readily from that. Obviously, up to this date, you know, other than for certain streaming partners who actually do go with HDR first for some of their episodic content or most of their original episodic content. Most movies that have been released and then released on in cinema and then in the home, the SDR version is done first for creative reasons and for business reasons, because in the cinema, you know, 99% of the cinemas out there are still SDR. That's going to change as we go into the future, and we think HDR doing the HDR grade first is actually going to become more commonplace. So I would say you can go either way, and I think you have the flexibility creatively to do either first. But essentially, I think doing HDR first, you get you're able to work with more of the image, more of your input image.
Yeah, and we'll run through that in the upcoming slides here in a few minutes. Great.
Great, thank you. Let's keep going.
Sure. Cool. So in terms of creating Dolby Vision content, we talked about early on that the cameras can, of course, capture this incredible dynamic range and wide color gamut. So one of the important pieces of the puzzle is to make sure that you capture the information properly. And the basic two formats that we recommend are camera raw is the best. And if not camera raw, then at least a 12-bit log for 4x4 format. So either like log C, S log, etc. If you do choose like a ProRes format, best to do like the 4x4 XQ format. Anytime you start going down the ladder to 10-bit 422 type capture, you're probably going to get less quality results. So important to understand, starting with the best camera raw or a 12-bit log 4x4 signal is the way to go. And in terms of film, you can also get amazing results in Dolby Vision from the negative film scan or an interpositive that's already had one layer, say, of chemical color correction, if you will. And again, there we recommend an ACES ADX or 16-bit log film scan. The next step of the process is understanding capture and on-set considerations. And so using a light meter, making sure that you expose your image properly and you don't clip in the camera is really important. But then aesthetically, monitoring on set is really a good idea, because in this image here of the young lady on the couch, you see that there's a lot of shiny, bright objects in the image, like on the table. There's a light behind her on both sides. And in SDR, that may look pretty flat and contained and normal with clipped highlights. But in HDR, those images may appear too bright. So it's important on set to start thinking about HDR and composing your images that way. And over time, as monitor prices come down and become more affordable, I think we'll see positive movement in that direction. Currently, in terms of dailies and editorial, most of that is done in SDR currently. We're seeing a movement towards HDR in dailies, and getting producers and other content creators and studio people looking at shots in HDR. In terms of editorial, most of the editorial systems can work in PQ and handle the HDR images. So what we're here to talk about, obviously, is VFX and pay some special attention there. So there's some good news here in the VFX world, and I'll let AB sort of pick up where the current workflow is and some of the recommendations that we've seen working with various partners on these types of workflows.
All right. Hi. So as far as VFX is concerned, you know, the VFX universe sort of has been working in a high dynamic range for many, many years. VFX is generally done in, you know, 16-bit float, and it's all uncompressed and very high quality. All that high dynamic range is there. The wide color gamut is there. It's just that you don't get to really see it. Most of your creative decisions are made probably in standard dynamic range. You know, all the monitors that you use in VFX are SDR. And that is why that when you go from your VFX facility, when you deliver something in an HDR pipeline to you know, a colorist for grading in HDR, that's sort of the first time that, yeah, okay. So if you look at this slide, this sort of explains what happens. You know, you more than often, you basically start with high dynamic range material. You probably content that's been shot on film or on a, you know, a digital camera that's capable of high dynamic range. You bring that in, you know, in its you know, full glory, so to speak.
Oh, we lost you, AB.
Yeah, we did lose AB. I don't know if you want to jump back in, Tom or Bill, until we get him back.
Sure, I can jump in.
Great.
So as AB was saying, you'll typically work on those log or raw images, and in order to work on them in your monitor and in your system, you'll probably have to add, say, a LUT or a transform to do that. Now, in order to see the full dynamic range of the image, you can do a technique called bracketing, which allows you to shift what part of the image you're looking at by, say, lowering the bracket down, say, 2 stops, or extending it up 2 stops to see the highlights. So of that 6.5 or 7 stops we talked about, you're basically choosing which 6 or 7 stops you want to look at. Do I want to look at the shadows? Do I want to look at the midtones? Or do I want to look at the highlights? And so in order to check your work and work on an SDR monitor, but make sure that you're delivering an image that's acceptable for HDR, bracketing is a technique that can be used. Another, so once this is done, once you deliver your content back in, say, camera space or log, back to the color grading system, you are now, the colorist is now working on creating this image and seeing the full dynamic range. And typically, if you've only monitored in SDR, you haven't done a lot of bracketing, you may find yourself getting more rejects and shots that need to be redone, where matte lines or other things may be popping through that weren't clearly visible in the SDR version.
Sorry about that. I think
No,
I just
no worries. You want to pick it up from here?
Sure. Yeah. That was funny. Yeah. So so the first time that you come across HDR, I mean, yeah, I think Tom probably covered that, is that when you create an SDR and send it to a colorist who's going to grade your images along with HDR images, background plates, and other footage, that's when you start seeing problems, right? So the colorist looks at it in HDR, and then he says, "Oh, I'm seeing I don't know, matte lines or wire removal. I'm seeing artifacts. I'm seeing there's clipping happening or things like that." And then you say, "We never saw that," and then that ends up with shots being rejected. They being sent back for redos, which is something that you don't really want in a pipeline, because typically rejects and redos mean that you need to probably recall a shot back into the main pipeline, have people look at it. That means that it takes time, it's more rendering, it's more creative time, and it typically tends to delay the rest of the process. So you're trying to push things forward, push shots through and get progress through the project. But every time something gets rejected or sent back for redo, you have a problem. So what we've been doing over the last 2 to 3 years is when you know that things are being delivered to an HDR or delivered for an HDR finish, we try to get the supervisors in the VFX facilities to start using HDR monitors, so that shots get presented or displayed on an HDR display before they are delivered to the colorist. That way, you tend to see that there is a lot less rejects and redos. Most of your problems are seen. I wouldn't say they are eliminated, but they are highly minimized.
Yeah.
Of course, having HDR monitors for every VFX artist is difficult. It's cost prohibitive. But having it at least with the lead supervisor or the lead or the group lead would definitely minimize problems. Tom?
Yeah, no, that's great. So we're basically saying having at least one HDR capable monitor that will allow you to check your images using, say, a transformer or a LUT to PQ, which was that was an earlier question, to view it in HDR before leaving the facility will save you time. And we actually did a panel discussion with 2 Netflix shows. This was at the HPA a year ago in February 2019. And that was essentially the main question, was the show that did VFX reviews in HDR before leaving had far less rejections and redos than the show that was only monitoring in SDR. And they were able to hit their timeline and stay closer to their budget by doing that. Another consideration in terms of VFX is titles. And AB, we worked closely with this facility in Los Angeles called Radley Studios that does a show for Netflix. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Radley did VFX as well, but I think they had a lot of problems with they used to do a lot of text effects. They, titling, different kinds of text and text-based animation and motion graphics and things like that. And they found that every time they put it back or blended it back into the main VFX shots in the color correction room, they would have problems. Uh, the colorist would have to go back and tell the VFX artist saying that, yeah, you guys, you need to watch out for this. The highlights are, clipping, they're too bright, or the colors don't look as good as they do here, and so on. So what they did was they actually brought an HDR monitor into the facility. They basically, it was on one floor, but what they did was they had people walk back and forth between the color grading room and the VFX part of the work group within the department, and they would constantly check shots before they were finally submitted. So every time they had they pretty much finished everything, they would say, okay, let's pop it up on the monitor, let's take a look at it. And then, and that really helped them. That really saved a lot of time. They kept telling us that, that was such a time saver. It really helped push things through much faster.
Yeah, one of the things to consider is when you do, say, text like humanity enhanced at 100 nits, and you basically are used to just creating 100% white, 100% white at PQ is 10,000 nits of peak brightness. So that title becomes almost blindingly bright. So there's an example where looking at something 100% in SDR versus 100% in HDR is completely different. So again, don't just think of in terms of traditional VFX, think of it in terms of all these amazing graphics that even documentaries like Unnatural Selection are using. In terms of monitors and pricing, there are the high-end monitors that we talked about, the Sony BVM HX310, the Flanders, and the ISO CG3145. These are all in that price range of $22,000 to $30,000, basically. They're expensive. They're able to be calibrated in a professional way to that 1,000 nit standard. More affordable are, say, the Apple XDR monitor that was just released. ISO makes some more affordable monitors, the CG319, and Asus does as well. These are in the typical $6,000 to $7,000 price range. And then finally, in terms of affordable, we have a consumer monitor that could be calibrated, like the Panasonic HZ2000 or the LG C9 or C8. These monitors are in that $2,000 to $5,000 range. In fact, LG just is announced and releasing this month, I believe, a 48-inch consumer monitor that shows great promise as a very affordable and portable monitor. This is the software I talked about earlier called CalMan, and you can see when you calibrate. This is a C8 that we calibrated here. You can see the colors can get pretty darn accurate in HDR and Dolby Vision, and we were able to calibrate the C8 to about 675 nits of peak brightness. Now, you might also need an additional piece of hardware like the Aja Hi-Fi 4K Plus that converts SDI out of your system to an HDMI and turns on the HDR flags. But this box is very affordable. I believe it's in the neighborhood of $500 or $600. The most expensive piece of the puzzle will be the light meter. And there's a lot of different choices. Dolby doesn't have a recommendation on that. You should consult with the folks at CalMan for their recommendations on light meters. So once you've created the VFX and you've sort of monitored them in HDR, you would now take the camera raw and the VFX files and you'd combine them together for color grading. And this is where the Dolby Vision magic really starts to take place. And Dolby Vision essentially is shot by shot dynamic metadata that is created by the colorist, it's adjusted by the colorist, and it's approved by the colorist. And then it goes through mastering, encoding, and delivery, and it handshakes with the television. And we're going to talk about how do you create that metadata. But essentially, that metadata created by the colorist is like the colorist essentially reaching in and controlling your TV to make it look correct. There are also several programs that help after mastering to insert logos and titles, or maybe edit out scenes for censorship or the like. And essentially, it's important that those also support this dynamic metadata because you have image and metadata together that need to maintain sync.
Hey, Tom. Tom,
Yes.
as you were just talking about content creation, I just want to toss you a quick question. Why are interpositive scans recommended over negative film scans? As you were talking about a little bit about that.
I would say, generally speaking, the negative scan is the most recommended, but it requires the most work. Some filmmakers choose to go with the interpositive because essentially, if it's a good interpositive, it's already had one level of color correction applied to it through chemical color correction. But generally speaking, the negative is probably the most preferred. It just requires more work.
Great, thank you so much.
All right, you got it. So in terms of color grading, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly so we have more time for questions. But essentially, you need a color grading system that supports Dolby Vision. And in this case, these are all the top color grading systems. You need a professional monitor that supports being able to be calibrated 100% to P3 and supports a peak brightness of at least 1,000 nits. And you also may or may not need a piece of hardware called the content mapping unit. Now, this is just a generic PC that supports the Dolby Vision software, and or some color grading systems like Baselight and Resolve have integrated in the Dolby content mapping function. We'll talk about what that does. So as Bill said earlier on, we recommend that you start with your best possible hero image first, which is that has the most dynamic range and the most color. So if you're used to spending 4 days color grading your 1 hour show, you would spend the 4 days creating the HDR master image. So in my case here, I'm starting with a 2000 nit Flanders or Canon monitor, and the colorist is spending all that time creating that beautiful, bright, colorful image. Now, it should be easier because you're not taking those 15 stops of dynamic range and squeezing it down into 7. You're not taking that wide color gamut and squeezing it down to Rec 709. You have more room to work, and there should be less fix-it work. So typically, we find that people are more creative and they don't have to use as many tricks of the trade like keys and power windows and those types of things. Once you're done creating that image, this essentially is your master HDR image. And then you start the Dolby Vision process, which is essentially you run an automatic analysis of each shot. So typically on a 1 hour show, on a fast computer with a lot of GPU power, you can run this in about an hour. So you might want to go to lunch. It goes through each shot and it finds the brightest pixel per shot, the average pixel value per shot, and the darkest pixel value per shot. And this basically creates what we call the first level of unique metadata. So each shot has these 3 values that describe the image. The next step in the process, and I should say, this is a perfectly acceptable Dolby Vision master, but typically on a show like a Netflix drama, you would want to look at the content and perhaps adjust it. And so this is the external CMU box. The signal, the HDR signal is split and it's fed into the CMU. And it's also connected to another monitor, which is a 100 nit SDR Rec 709 monitor. and the metadata and image are fed through the CMU, and in real time, the CMU maps it down to standard dynamic range based on that analysis level 1 metadata. And most people think it does a really, really good job, gets you about 80% of the way there, making the image look correct. It's an automatic algorithm, and the next part of the puzzle is the colorist can then use familiar controls like lift, gamma, gain, chroma weight, offset, saturation, and they can adjust that mapping. And this is known as level 2 metadata, or the 100 nit SDR trim pass. On a 1 hour show, this might take about half a day if you really stretched it. You'll notice that in this case, the colorist adjusted the first shot and the third shot, and they chose not to adjust the second shot. They felt the mapping was fine. You can also copy and paste trim metadata, and that also helps speed up the process as well. And now essentially you have level 1 and level 2 metadata that you can also even do an additional 600 nit HDR pass. So our 2000 nit image can be mapped down to 600 nits, which, by the way, is very similar to what the average luminance is for most HDR televisions that you'd find on the market. This is optional though, and not every studio requires it. Some do, some don't. And this, because you've done the 100 nit pass, the 600 nit pass is interpolated and goes pretty darn quick. So essentially, by creating the master image, say at 2000 nits, and then confirming and adjusting the metadata at 100 nits, you're creating anchor points on the tone curve so that any television in between, whether it's an 800 nit television, a 400 nit television, can take that metadata and map accordingly on a shot-by-shot basis. So it's essentially that CMU process is emulating what the Dolby Vision process is doing inside each individual television, and allowing the colorist to confirm and adjust all the situations where the mapping would occur. So I'll pause there if there's any questions about the Dolby Vision part of the process.
I think you actually addressed the questions that had come in on that area in your remarks.
Okay, great. So once you're done, you basically create your image delivery. It could either be a ProRes 4x4XQ file, or if it's going, say, for deep archive, it might be a 16-bit TIFF sequence. And then you export the Dolby Vision XML as a very small data file that contains all the metadata you've created. That gets fed into a mastering system like Transcoder, Clipster, Cortex, Mist, or possibly even Resolve. And this is where you might add additional logos, like for instance, the Netflix logo might be added up front, and you may need to create metadata. You can also render out versions of your film or your show. Say, for instance, you want a 100 nit rendered version that is from the mapping that you've created. This is where you could also do that. But essentially, the mezzanine that you create is a 12-bit mezzanine, and that is what ultimately gets sent and to encoding. So in terms of Netflix, they would take a single delivery, which is a 12-bit JPEG 2000 MXF, and they would encode 3 different versions for their service. They would encode a Dolby Vision version, a HDR10 version, and an SDR Rec 709 version, all from that single metadata and image source using that Dolby Vision mapping. So anybody who has the Dolby Vision TV would get the Dolby Vision stream, and anybody who has the HDR10 TV would get the HDR stream, and anybody who has an SDR TV would get that version. So you can see from a studio standpoint and a delivery standpoint, it does simplify things. And as Bill said, we strongly believe that by creating the HDR image first and then doing this Dolby Vision mapping process, we found that often the detail that you get in the high dynamic range version can be very well maintained all the way down to a standard dynamic range TV. Whereas if you do that separately, creating SDR, say, first, and then try to do HDR later, they often can look different, and you won't see as much detail, say, in the highlights that you can get from this process. In terms of Dolby Vision content partners, we have all the major studios on board creating Dolby Vision content. In terms of streaming services, everything from the new Apple TV, Disney Plus, Netflix, iTunes, and then of course overseas we have partners like Rakuten, iQIYI, Tencent, Youku, etc. If you're looking for a new TV, you can check out CNET's rankings, or you can also check out that ratings.com that I told you about. Typically, year over year, the LGs are the highest rated TVs, but really Dolby Vision, I think, is roughly 8 of the top 10 TVs on the rankings are Dolby Vision TVs. And you don't necessarily have to break the bank. I mean, some of the TCLs at Costco start as low as $300 or $400 to get into a Dolby Vision display. And then, of course, there's many other devices in the ecosystem, everything from iPhones, iPads, MacBook Pros, Dell laptops, Lenovo laptops, all sorts of streaming sticks, UHD Blu-ray players, gaming consoles, and set-top boxes from cable distributors. So lots of different ways to consume Dolby Vision at this point. I believe we're over 500 million devices, Dolby Vision enabled devices in the ecosystem now. And it's happening. There's a lot of momentum. And also I mentioned earlier on, we do have a Dolby Cinema, which are obviously currently shuttered at the moment. In the US, it's mostly AMCs. And we have a laser projector that really makes the experience quite amazing. These are just a comparison of what a standard digital cinema projector can do. In terms of luminance, a very narrow contrast ratio, 2000:1, with a peak luminance of roughly around 48 nits. And the Dolby Cinema projector is more than capable of being at least twice as bright, if not more, but having pure black. And so you get this amazing contrast ratio of roughly 1,000,000:1. So if you get a chance to go see a movie like the new Bond in the fall, I highly recommend going to see it in a Dolby Cinema. So that's it. We made it roughly in an hour, and I'm happy to answer more questions from our viewers. I see we still have a bunch of participants. How are we doing on questions?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we got you.
Sorry. 2 questions. One, from someone tuning in. I'm a big fan of Dolby Cinema theaters, but I've noticed several theaters with exit and floor lights washing color onto the screen. Is that something that you're looking into to better control light in the cinema setting?
That's a great question, and is a challenge because in terms of any cinema, whether it's DCI or Dolby Cinema, those exit lights or emergency row lights can have a cast on the screen, and we do try to work with them to make them very directional so that we are meeting safety codes, and understand it's a problem. Bill, do you have any other info other than that?
No, not really. I mean, basically, some of the theaters actually have brighter exit signs than the code actually calls for. And we do work with them to try and address that. But the theaters are really run by the exhibitors, and they pretty much have the control. We offer our suggestions, but it's really up to them to manage sort of the design of the auditorium and how the light affects the screen. But we do encourage them to try and minimize that especially because of the contrast range of our projector.
Got it. We just have two more questions and then we'll take it to a close. When you mentioned bracketing, if no monitor is available, are you just talking about the exposure tool in Nuke and or RV? Just pushing the image in both directions there?
Bill, you want to grab that one?
Yeah, generally, yeah, it's about exposure, but how you actually do it, I guess, is dependent on the facility and how, you know, the workflow and pipeline at the facility. But generally, it's an exposure thing, either in Nuke or whatever, another, maybe possibly the lighting tool, whatever you're using for lighting.
Got it. Just a few others, and then we'll take it home. What about the conversion from Dolby to HD10 or HD10 plus? Is it done automatically?
Sure. So I can take that one. So essentially, HDR10 is a generic standard for HDR images. So essentially, it has two values: average pixel value for the entire show and brightest pixel value for the entire show. And those values can be calculated with a lot of basic software tools, and they can be added to the Dolby Vision metadata. Now, one of the other interesting aspects is in the example I gave of mastering at 2000 nits, and we did the trim at 100, and maybe we did a trim at 600 or 1000. Oftentimes, a studio will take that mapping and they'll render out a 1000 nit version for HDR10. So they'll use the Dolby Vision mapping to create a better mapped signal that fits better into the HDR10 capable TVs. And they leverage that Dolby Vision workflow to do that. They then add the MaxFall, MaxCLL two values for HDR10 to the Dolby Vision XML. And then when it goes to Netflix or whoever, you know, to be encoded and distributed, the HDR10 version is able to play. So it's certainly considered in the Dolby Vision process. In terms of HDR10 plus, it also is a dynamic metadata that there's not a lot known about how people are really sort of working on it, but essentially from everything that I've heard, it's an automatic process that happens sort of in the mastering, and it's not really approved or adjusted by the colorist. So hopefully that answers your question.
Got it. We're just going to do a little more lightning round and we'll come. Okay. What's the recommended VFX intermediate color space? ACES, CCT, or something else?
Yeah, I would think ACES is a good way to go. But I guess it's pipeline and facility dependent. Bill, you can chime in, but
That's
I've
pretty much
seen-
the answer. I mean,
Yeah.
we don't Dolby. I mean, as far as Dolby Vision or in general high dynamic range, it really is a facility decision, and you know, it's supported pretty much. Dolby Vision or any HDR format supports ACES or ACES CT, but it just depends on the facility and how they would like you to work.
Okay, and here's our final question. Final Jeopardy. In case your primary grading is in HDR 1000 nits and you did an SDR mapping with Dolby Vision, you said Dolby Vision interpolates other steps in between. If you now do a mapping on 600 nits, will this be used as a sort of keyframe for the interpolation of the other steps?
Yeah, so you could definitely do primary grading at 1000 nits. That's probably the most common. And also the most common is you would do the SDR mapping by doing the 100 nit trim pass. So those are sort of the minimum. I think if say you were doing a show for Netflix or Warner Brothers or what have you. Now, in terms of the 600 nit trim pass, it is kind of good, I guess, to think of it as another additional keyframe per shot, if you will. It's not required, but it allows the filmmaker, further adjustment to how that tone curve mapping will occur. In the examples that I've seen with certain filmmakers, they might adjust every shot on the 100 nit trim pass, even if slightly. But when it comes to the 600 nit trim pass, they may only adjust 1 or 2 shots per reel. So because you've done most of the work at the 100 nits, the 600 nits goes very, very quickly. And again, those are anchor points so that if you have a 400 nit TV and you have a 600 nit and a 100 nit anchor, it's obviously going to lean closer to the 600 nit on that tone curve of interpolation.
Yeah, just
So
to kind
hopefully-
of cap that off. Yeah, to kind
Yeah,
of
go
cap
ahead.
that off. It does act as a keyframe, if you want to think of it that way, for the interpolation method over the entire range. So as Tom just said, if you have a 600 nit trim, the interpolation goes between the 100 nit and the 600 nit, then the 600 nit is locked down, and then above 600 nit, it goes from 600 to 1,000 or 4,000 or whatever the other endpoint is.
Okay, well, I think we'll take it to a close, because we're not going to be able to take everyone's questions, but I want to thank you, Tom, Bill, and Aby. And thanks to everybody who joined us today on Zoom and on Facebook Live for VFX Pro's Home Edition on HDR and Dolby Vision. I want to say to the many people who asked, yes, we definitely recorded this session. We'll have the replay link up as soon as possible on our social media channels, and you'll see that. And for folks tuning in, if you enjoyed today's session, you can make plans to meet us right back here this coming Friday, April 17th at 3 o'clock Pacific time for our interactive discussion on compositing, a VFXer's Inside Guide. So thank you, Tom, Aby, and Bill. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe and well. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.